Hello, a very good morning to you and welcome to BBC News at 9. The government will this morning publish the full legal advice it was given on Theresa May's Brexit plan after the bruising the government suffered at the hands of MPs in the Commons yesterday. And later, the Prime Minister will continue trying to bolster support for her deal during further parliamentary debate ahead of next Tuesday's crucial vote. But yesterday's defeat suggests Theresa May faces an uphill struggle. So let's examine some of the key points. It took just over an hour for the government to suffer 3 significant defeats, the first time that's happened since the 1970s. One of those votes found the government in contempt of Parliament, which is why the full legal advice will now be published. The Leader of the House of Commons, Andrea Leadsom, says this will happen at 11:30 this morning. Another defeat was on an amendment brought by Conservative backbencher Dominic Grieve. He was supported by a further 25 Tory rebels. That amendment means that if the Prime Minister's deal is rejected, MPs will have another vote on what course of action the government should take next. Today's debate resumes at about 1 o'clock after Prime Minister's questions, and today will focus on immigration and security issues. So just how damaging were those 3 losses to Theresa May? And with 4 days of debating to go, will the government be able to recover in time for Tuesday's all-important vote? Our political correspondent Ian Watson considers the importance of yesterday's defeats.
Fighting for her deal, fighting for her job. The second day of the Brexit debate will focus on security, but some MPs wonder how secure Theresa May is in number 10. She'll be hoping today is better than yesterday, when her government was defeated 3 times. As a result, ministers will have to announce today when they'll publish legal advice on Brexit that they wanted to keep confidential. And if Theresa May's deal is defeated next week, MPs will now get a greater say over what happens next. Based on day 1 of the debate, Theresa May will have an uphill battle to get her way.
I have spent nearly 2 years negotiating this deal. If I had banged the table, walked out of the room and at the end of the process delivered the very same deal that is before us today, some might say that I'd done a better job. But I didn't play to the gallery. I focused on getting a deal that honours the referendum, sets us on course for a bright future, and I did so through painstaking hard work.
She was attacked by the official opposition.
Labour will vote against this deal. A bad deal for Britain, a bad deal for our economy, and, I believe, a bad deal for our democracy. Our country deserves better than this.
And the unofficial opposition.
I really can't believe that there is a single member of this House who sincerely believes that this deal we have before us is a good deal for the UK.
The debate was closed by the Brexit Secretary Stephen Barclay in the early hours of the morning, and the Speaker made it clear there wouldn't be much respite for MPs.
It is a case of debate to be resumed what day? Tomorrow, thank you. Indeed today. Today. It is indeed today.
Just 4 days of debate to go, then Theresa May's deal will be put to the test. Ian Watson, BBC News, Westminster.
And let's talk now to our assistant political editor Norman Smith at Westminster. Norman, it's interesting, this time yesterday we were speculating that even if the government was to be found in contempt of Parliament, which it was, there was no guarantee that that full legal advice would be published. Yet here we are today, a couple of hours away from that happening. What can we expect to see in that full legal advice?
Well, it's a paradox, Anita, that I suspect when the full legal advice is published, it will probably make not one jot of difference to the debate over Brexit, because MPs have pretty much made up their mind on the legal constraints surrounding the Northern Ireland backstop. They listened to the Attorney General in the Commons answering questions for more than 2 hours. On Monday, they've seen the 43-page summary of the legal advice and they've formed their view. So unless there is some stunning new revelation in the actual text of the formal legal position, I think it won't have any impact at all in the way MPs are going to vote. The real impact was, one, the sort of symbolism of the government being found in contempt of Parliament. I mean, I spoke to, the sort of parliamentary buffs here at Westminster, and no one could find any precedent for that ever, no government it seems, has ever been found in contempt before. So there was the sort of symbolic impact of that. There was also the numbers factor. Bear in mind, Mrs May was defeated on the contempt motion, despite the fact that the Tory Brexiteers actually supported her on that. And what does that mean? That means Mrs May was still losing votes when she had the support of Tory Brexiteers, who almost certainly will not back her when it comes to the meaningful vote, which just sort of fuels the sense that Mrs May is heading to almost inevitable defeat, albeit her ministers are still trying to drum up support for MPs to back her deal as the best compromise. Here, Michael Gove, leaving for work this morning.
We're going to make a powerful argument that this deal is in the best interests of the country. Everyone has to think at this momentous moment, do we want to ensure that Brexit gets over the line? Do we want to deliver on the verdict of the 17.4 million people who voted to leave the European Union? Because if we don't back the Prime Minister, we risk there being no Brexit, and that, I think, would be a fatal blow to faith in democracy.
So what's your message to Brexiteers? Because the amendment looks like a no deal is less likely, a softer Brexit.
I think the most important thing to do is to vote for the Prime Minister's deal. That's the way to secure Brexit and to secure the future of the country.
You know, what is interesting, Anita, is that many MPs have now moved on mentally to Plan B. What happens from the wreckage of Mrs May's deal if, as expected, it goes down? And yesterday, perhaps the most significant thing was we saw the emergence of this block of sort of centrist Tory grey suits pushing for a Plan B by passing an amendment, which in effect means if Mrs May's deal gets voted down, Parliament can step in and say what should happen next. And these are figures who are very, very influential in the Tory party. You're talking about people like Damien Green, Mrs May's former deputy, Michael Fallon, former Defence Secretary, Nick Boles, a man who's been pushing the Norway option, Oliver Letwin, key fixer in the party, and everyone is now talking about Plan B, whether it's a second referendum, Norway, or indeed, as Dominic Raab, the former Brexit Secretary, was suggesting this morning, going back to Brussels and asking to renegotiate the backstop.
I think if this deal is voted down, we make the changes that will be necessary to render this deal palatable in terms of the long-term interests of our country, our children, the next generation, and we also make clear that we're ramping up the preparations for no deal. We don't want that outcome, but we're not going to be bullied into submission, and I think that's the way we're most likely to get a sensible, pragmatic response from the EU, but we need to be willing to, as in any negotiation, to walk away if they're not going to continue to try and sense weakness in the UK and bully and blackmail us into submission to what are frankly appalling terms in the last analysis of this deal.
The Labour front bench seem to have their own Plan B, and that is to go back and negotiate a better deal. Here's Shami Chakrabarti.
In the past, the EU has had it had to renegotiate the Lisbon Treaty, for example, when a number of parliaments in particular countries didn't like the original version. So whatever people say, there's plenty of form and plenty of precedent for renegotiating when a deal can't pass through a particular parliament.
So where are we today? A couple of things to watch. One is how Mrs May just sort of recovers from the catastrophe of yesterday. That will get a sense of her demeanour, how she's going to appeal to MPs at Prime Minister's questions, and then secondly, maybe even more importantly, how much sort of oomph there is behind these Tory MPs trying to pull together a Plan B, and how far they might be able to work with sort of centrist Labour MPs to chart a different course for Brexit.
Okay, as you say, Norman, much to watch today. Thank you very much, Norman Smith at Westminster. Now, the British academic who was held for nearly 7 months in the United Arab Emirates on spying charges has said he felt as if he was being mentally tortured. Matthew Hedges was jailed for life but returned to the UK last month after being pardoned. In his first broadcast interview to the BBC, he said he was pressurised into confessing after aggressive questioning gave him panic attacks, and he described some of the treatment he endured.
It was lonely and isolating, completely, as the name suggests. there was no natural light. As I said yesterday to a publication, there was no light. I wasn't allowed to do anything to try and distract myself.
You couldn't listen to a radio or anything of that sort?
Not until I had started the court case and my mental health had deteriorated quite substantially. Then I was allowed some form of distraction.
Were you shackled at all?
Yes, I was. Whenever I had to go to the bathroom or on occasion, use the shower, I would be escorted by 4 guards and I would wear ankle cuffs. Whenever I was transported between different premises, I was blindfolded and handcuffed.
And you had to stand up for quite a long time?
Yes, so one of the days when I had tried to, again, tell the truth to the interrogators, their reaction was to make me stand for the day wearing ankle cuffs.
All day?
Yes.
How did you feel? I mean, how did you manage that? I mean, it must have been exhausting.
It was. It's mentally exhausting. Physically, the adrenaline takes over. And so obviously afterwards I was pretty sore, but it's how it made you feel mentally.
Did you feel that you were being tortured?
Psychologically, correct. Yes, it felt like it.
Matthew Hedges alongside his wife Daniela speaking to BBC Radio 4's Today programme. The Home Office has been accused of failing to act on repeated warnings about the negative effect its measures to curb illegal immigration would have on members of the Windrush generation. A report from the National Audit Office says the department operated a target-driven policy and it's yet to establish the full scale of the scandal. Here's our Community Affairs correspondent, Adina Campbell.
The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans.
They were invited over to help rebuild post-war Britain, but many of the children from the Windrush generation were never given official documents to prove their right to legally remain in the UK. Now a new report from the National Audit Office says attempts by the Home Office to target illegal immigration, previously known as hostile environment, had severe consequences on the Windrush community, despite a number of warnings. Since the scandal came to light, more than 6,500 calls have been made to a special task force set up by the Home Office to help people sort out their legal status. About a third of those cases have now been resolved, but 164 people have been removed or detained, even though they might have been a long-term UK residents. The Home Office says it's determined to right the wrongs of the past and has set up a review to learn lessons from what's happened. But government action is taking too long and too many lives have been turned upside down.
People's lives have been ruined because of the way they've been treated by this government. They've been treated beneath contempt, is the way to explain it.
The National Audit Office is now recommending that the Home Office puts better measures in place to help stop similar problems in the future. Adina Campbell, BBC News.
And Patrick Vernon is a Windrush campaigner who earlier this year submitted a petition to the government calling for amnesty from deportation for people who migrated to Britain as children between 1948 and 1971. And he's here with me now. Patrick, you're very welcome.
Yes.
This report confirms some things we already knew, but it says the Home Office has still not established the scale of this scandal. Does this fit with what you've been finding out in your campaign?
Absolutely. So when the scandal broke in April and when Theresa May apologised and then Amber Rudd apologised, then resigned, there was an initial degree of urgency. They launched the fast-track scheme and so far I think 5,000 cases have been fast-tracked in terms of getting sorted out the citizenship. But what's quite clear with the National Audit Office report and what's happening on the ground is things have slowed down. There's not that degree of energy or inertia to solve this issue. So my petition, which I did back in April, was to recognise that people are from Windrush generation and their children and other parts of the Commonwealth that came to Britain between 1948 and the 70s are British citizens, and they should have automatic status. What you have now is a situation whereby you have a massive backlog of cases. The audit report identifies maybe there could be as much as another 150, 200,000 people who have not come forward yet, which means a lot of people don't trust the Home Office. And one of the reasons why, what they've seen and how people have still been treated as a result of the hostile environment.
I think it's worth reminding us all about the injustices that people have suffered as a result of this policy, Patrick.
Yes, so the people who've shared their experiences in the media over the last several months have talked about not accessing their state pensions, not being able to access universal credit, people have lost their jobs, people have lost their housing, people have had massive financial debt, as a result of not being able to work and have income, people have been living in food banks, and ultimately, in the UK, there have been 2 deaths of Dexter Bristol and Sarah O'Connell, who both died of stroke and hypertension because of the stress and emotional impact of them trying to fight for their status. So the National Audit Office looks at value for money, and what's quite clear that the hostile environment is not value for money in a sense that it's actually terrorised, discriminated against Caribbean, African people and other Commonwealth nationals.
This report from the National Audit Office says that the government is showing, present tense, is showing a lack of curiosity about individuals who are not of Caribbean heritage but who are affected by these immigration policies.
Yes, yeah, so obviously a lot of people talk about the Caribbean and a lot of people from the Caribbean have been affected by the hostile environment, but equally a lot of people from Africa have been affected too. So for example, Caroline Lucas MP did a written question to Caroline Noakes, the Minister for the Home Office, and she admitted that there were 49 people in Africa that were deported who are British citizens, and the Home Office have not made any attempts whatsoever to engage or to bring them back or to even say, do you want to come back to the UK and sort out your status?
You've talked about the initial urgency slowing down, about a feeling of inertia. What would you say to the Home Office today, and do you think that people of this heritage still feel there is a hostile environment?
There's still, I mean, they use the word compliance, but it's still hostile because you still have immigration vans going around Britain. 3 things need to happen. The Home Office needs to, and through the government, give automatic status and to reduce the burden of people proving that they're British. Secondly, there needs to be a public inquiry. What's quite clear from the National Audit Office, there is a trail and there's some evidence still missing about the government directly in number 10. And I think thirdly, more importantly, compensation. People have lost out emotionally, financially as a result of the hostile environment. They need to be recompensed fairly and properly, and more importantly, we need to have a public inquiry so we really know the true lessons learnt as a result of this policy of the government, which ultimately, and I think Theresa May as Prime Minister should apologise for its policy. This policy has caused a lot of hurt, a lot of harm, and she has to admit that this is wrong and flawed and it has an impact on British citizens.
Patrick, thank you very much for coming along to talk to us. Patrick Vernon, Windrush campaigner.
Thank you.
A look now at the headlines for you on BBC News at 9. It's 19 minutes past 9. After being defeated in the House of Commons yesterday, the government will this morning publish the full legal advice it was given on Theresa May's Brexit plan after it was found to be in contempt of Parliament. In his first broadcast interview since being freed, British academic Matthew Hedges, accused of spying and jailed in the United Arab Emirates, says he felt as if he were being mentally tortured. The Home Office is accused of failing to heed repeated warnings about the negative effects its immigration policies would have on the Windrush generation.
And in sport, Manchester City march on in the Premier League. Their 2-1 win over Watford was their 13th in 15 matches this season. Jose Mourinho had another rant ahead of Manchester United's match versus Arsenal tonight. He's criticised TV pundits who say he's lost the dressing room. And former Chelsea and Manchester United director Peter Kenyon is heading a consortium that's in talks to buy Newcastle. Owner Mike Ashley is willing to sell. We don't know yet if there's been a confirmed bid, but I can tell you, Anita, we will explain it all in the next half hour. We'll explain the whole Newcastle United story and how they got to this point.
Sally, thank you. We await that explanation. The office investigating alleged Russian collusion in the 2016 US election has said it will not be pursuing a jail sentence for former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Mr. Flynn has admitted lying to the FBI, but in a memo, Special Counsel Robert Mueller said he had provided substantial assistance to prosecutors. President Donald Trump has called the investigation a witch and denies any wrongdoing. Ryanair is facing legal action by the airline regulator over its refusal to compensate thousands of UK-based customers. Flights were cancelled or delayed over the summer because of strikes by Ryanair pilots and cabin crew. The Civil Aviation Authority says they're entitled to compensation under EU law. Doctors in Brazil have revealed that for the first time, a healthy baby has been born to a woman using a womb transplanted from a dead donor. The 10-hour operation and the following fertility treatment took place in 2016. There have been nearly 40 womb transplants using live donors, and those resulted in 11 babies. But the 10 previous transplants from a deceased donor had failed. Well, let's talk now to Dr. Valentina Candia, a consultant gynecologist who leads the Bristol Centre for Reproductive Medicine. Very good morning to you and thanks for joining us. Why do you think in this instance the transplant resulted in the birth of a healthy baby girl?
First of all, good morning, and it's a very exciting development. It's difficult to say. I haven't got full details of what happened. But certainly what is clear that it's the first successful transplant from a non-living donor. Potential possibilities for why it's been successful include how long it took from death to the uterus being transplanted, so it might have been more fresh than in other circumstances, but that's difficult to say. The other thing, of course, is that in terms of how this is beneficial, is that in patients where a living donor is used, there are substantial risks to the donor, including the risks of surgery. So certainly having a non-living donor where the proof of birth is a major positive step.
The recipient of this uterus had a syndrome which meant that her own uterus had failed to form properly. Are there many women out there, do we have any idea about the figures of the numbers of women who might benefit from a transplant like this?
Indeed. So the woman who received the uterus in this case had something called Mayer-Rokitansky-Hauser syndrome, where a woman is born without a uterus, but she has ovaries. So she's able to produce eggs and therefore have potentially create an offspring, but doesn't have anywhere to grow the baby. And therefore surgery such as this or transplant such as this is required. I think the incidence of this is somewhere, and it's certainly less than 1,000, so it's quite rare. But there are other patients who could benefit from such surgery, including patients who've had cancer, patients who have what's known as uterine factor infertility, i.e. it's not possible for them to grow a baby in their uterus, and this includes women who have very severe fibroids, women who've had a hysterectomy for whatever reason, women have something called Asherman syndrome, where the lining of the womb where a baby would grow is completely scarred and therefore a baby can't grow there. Women who have something where the uterus is also enlarged due to adenomyosis or severe endometriosis, and so in these cases where the uterus is severely affected by pathology or is absent, it offers exciting opportunity for them now to be able to carry a baby. But of course there still needs to be more research. It's not without risks. It's not guaranteed that having a womb transplant will be successful. As you've said, there have been a number of attempts using non-living donors that have not been successful. The surgery is technically challenging, takes a long time, and there's also the risk of rejection of the donor organ by the recipient. So you need to take drugs for for a great length of time.
So in that way, like any other organ transplant that people might be more familiar with, there is a risk of rejection. That's correct.
And there's not only the risk of, because of how technically challenging the surgery is, there's also that risk that, and sometimes there are risks of infection, there are risks of clotting problems where the surgery has happened as well. So it's more challenging and not as established as heart and kidney transplants, etc.
Okay, we appreciate your time this morning, Dr. Valentina Candy, consultant gynecologist. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
China says it's going to push forward with trade negotiations with the United States and that changes agreed with President Trump would be implemented as soon as possible. But China has not confirmed Washington's claims that it would cut tariffs on American cars immediately. It comes after a series of tweets by President Trump saying he'll impose tariffs if a trade deal can't be reached. Today we're looking at council funding and how it impacts services across England, because tomorrow local authorities are expected to find out how much money they'll receive for the next financial year. In North Yorkshire, funding for buses has been stripped back so much that people living there face being cut off. One council says it now relies on a volunteer-led solution to allow people to remain mobile. Tom Burridge has been to find out more.
This a community car, driven by volunteers like Roger.
How's your husband getting on with the...
Oh, not too good.
Is how one cash-strapped council is moving people like Chris, who has a learning disability,
Christopher, your big day today.
And Veronica around.
Well, it's very vital. I don't know where we'd be without it, because we're sort of an elderly community and we wouldn't be able to get out.
Today, a stark warning about public transport in rural areas like Pateley Bridge. There's been a spiral of decline, says the Campaign for Better Transport, with no national strategy. Rural bus usage has plummeted in recent years, in North Yorkshire by a whopping 78%.
If few people travel on them, then why should taxpayers' money keep rural buses going? But for some of the most lonely, vulnerable people, they're vital. So the question becomes, what is their social value? And what is the social cost if you take them away?
Money is not pouring into the council, so subsidised services face the chop. But one local business is keeping the number 4 running on Sundays.
We wanted to ensure that the community continued having this service, and we thought it would be a dying shame to let it go. And we funded it for 2 years, and let's see how we get on.
A number of years ago, a route like this in this condition would be almost fully supported by the local authority. Over 40% of mileage funded by local authorities has gone over the past 6 years.
There was a time when North Yorkshire County Council would subsidise 2 or 3 passengers in a bus, and actually it could cost as much as £40 or £50 per passenger journey. Now clearly that wasn't sustainable and it wasn't a good use of public money.
A better use, says the council, is leasing one of these, where volunteers drive people like Sarah, aged 92, for a small fare on the most important of trips.
I think it's marvellous, this community car.
Her husband Norman is now in care.
I miss my husband. I've been married for 72 years and I thought we would enjoy this time of our life, but had been taken from us.
So a journey to see a husband is possible.
Sarah.
Even when public money for transport is short, people in picturesque, isolated places still need to get around. Tom Burridge, BBC News in North Yorkshire.
And we approached the Department for Transport about this. They said they're giving councils extra powers to work with bus companies, as well as investing £250 million every year to support bus services. And you can find more reports into the spending issues facing local government on the BBC's Reality Check website. The winner of this year's Turner Prize has been announced. Video artist Charlotte Prodger won the Contemporary Art Award with a film about coming out as gay in rural Scotland, which was shot entirely on her mobile phone. She's won £25,000 and said she was quite overwhelmed and very touched to win. In a moment we'll have the weather forecast for you, but first let's find out what Victoria has got on her programme coming up at 10 o'clock.